Hello and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Plan Eat Online Farmers Market. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld and I'm your host. Together, we'll hear from leaders in environmental science, agriculture, medicine, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and more. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to hear all the latest in healthy and sustainable food with Food for You and the Planet. Today's episode features Nick Jacobs, Consulting Director at IPES-Food, the international panel of experts on sustainable food systems. IPES-Food is a global think tank and expert group guiding action for sustainable food systems around the world. Nick is a specialist in agri-food, trade, and development policy with a background in media communications and political research. From 2011 to 2014, Nick was a member of the support team to the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Olivier De Schutter, Rapporteur from 2008 to 2014, as the Communications and Research Assistant. Previously, he worked as a journalist for Agra Europe, providing coverage of EU agriculture and trade policy and writing in detail on common agricultural policy reform, biofuels, GMOs, trade negotiations, and other issues affecting the EU agricultural sector. From 2010 to 2014, he also blogged on EU politics for EU Observer. Nick holds an MA in Modern Languages from Cambridge University and a Master in Science in Globalization and Development from the University of Antwerp. Thank you so much for being here today, Nick.
Thank you, Rosemary. It's a pleasure.
What is IPES-Food and what type of work does it do?
So IPES-Food is an expert panel bringing together 25 of the foremost experts on food systems from around the world. So food systems is this really vast area. And within our panel, we try to make sure all the different areas of knowledge within that are represented. So we have nutritionists, agronomists, environmental scientists, political scientists, and alongside those different scientific disciplines, we also have practitioners from civil society and social movements. So people who've really been on the front lines of battles to improve the quality of food, to ensure food security and sustainable food systems. So it's a panel that really brings together a lot of different expertise and different types of knowledge. We hope that therefore bringing a kind of really authoritative voice on what needs to be done to improve food systems around the world.
How did you become interested in a career in food and agriculture with IPES-Food?
So my career started out as a journalist. I was writing about the common agricultural policy. I was lucky to find a great journalism role doing that in Brussels. And I really came into the topic at that point without any prior knowledge or interest. I think like very many people, I shopped in the supermarket without giving it too much thought, looking at the price of the food, trying to throw together a cheap and tasty meal. But I really didn't spend much time thinking about food and certainly not the farming systems behind it. But through that first job, I realized, how vast and interesting this and important this whole subject area is. And although, I was writing on some pretty technical debates around the budget of the EU common agricultural policies, rules affecting the pig sector, the poultry sector, trade disputes, all these kind of things, I started to really appreciate the importance of this sector and the fact that, whether you care about the climate, biodiversity, healthy diets, it all really hinges on how we produce food and the policies that are guiding the agricultural systems we have. So that job kind of opened up this whole area to me, and from there on, I went back to studies. I did a master's on globalization development, so really taking an interest in aspects of this question, around the global south and how food systems are organized globally. And from there moved into a communications role in the team of the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, as you mentioned. So yeah, gradually broadening out from sort of writing about agriculture to working on food systems as a whole. And it's really a great topic to work on. You never get bored with the breadth of different questions. One day you can be working on genetically modified crops. The next day you're thinking about food versus fuel, debates around biofuels, and then so many interesting questions around nutrition and public health that really affect our daily lives.
So when did IPES-Food begin, and what are some of the key moments in the organization's history?
So IPES-Food was founded in 2015, which means we're still a relatively young organization now, 9 years in, but it still feels quite new in a field where you have so many organizations that are very well established. And I think some key milestones. I mean, first of all, in the first couple of years after IPES-Food was founded, we really spent a lot of time on really foundational work, trying to establish, first of all, the concept of kind of food system analysis, which is now fairly well established, but at the time a bit less so. So an important milestone was really the first report we put out, which was essentially about the science of sustainable food systems and about the need to really look at these systems as a whole. In that early period, we were also doing, foundational work to promote the transition to agroecology. And again, this is the term now, agroecology, also regenerative agriculture, that are, I think, pretty well known at this point, pretty well established in policy debates. But if we rewind 10 years, when IPES-Food was founded, they were pretty fringe. I think the FAO first organized a symposium on agroecology around 2016. And one of our first big reports was called Uniformity to Diversity. And it was essentially drawing a contrast between the industrial food systems that are becoming increasingly dominant around the world and the diversified agroecological systems that IPES-Food believes should really be underpinning the sustainable food systems of the future. So again, that was another really foundational piece that we started out working on. Then if we fast forward a bit, I think around 2019, another important milestone for us was some regional work that we did. First of all, in Europe. So our reports generally have a global focus, but in 2019, we concluded a 3-year project that was working with a whole range of European partners to develop a vision for European food systems reform, what we referred to as a common food policy. So that was an important milestone for us in terms of really having an impact on a specific regional debate, and also working very closely with civil society partners and other scientific groups to bring together a big coalition around those ideas. And maybe we'll touch on that a bit more later. I'd say another big milestone, I think, for us and everyone working on food systems then was the kind of period of nonstop crises that we've seen through 2021 through to the present day, with COVID-19 pandemic, closely followed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, both of which had huge impacts on food supply chains, massive interruptions of food production, food distribution, impacts on food prices, which we're still seeing today. So for our work, that was a really important milestone and certainly pushed us towards some more reactive work, some quick briefing notes and interventions to try to really respond to those debates and shape the policy response in a kind of very rapidly shifting landscape. So those are some key milestones along the way, and I'd say we're still very much in a phase of trying to make sense of those crises and those changes in the landscape right now.
How do people become part of the panel of experts that works on these issues?
So when we come to the end of a 3-year period, so a 3-year mandate, which the panel serves, we have a nomination process within the panel. So the existing panel members will put forward the names of people who they would like to see in the panel. At the same time, there's a window for existing panel members to step down, or they can continue to serve for another 3 years. And through essentially then we harvest this long list of names and we discuss them as a panel, and we try to whittle it down to a short list, and then by consensus within the panel, we'll adopt a set of names, experts who we'd like to bring into the panel, and then they'll be approached to join, and at that point we just hope that they'll say yes. And I think, you know, when we're doing that, the criteria that we use to really select the best candidates, first of all, it's people who are willing to work collegially, right? Because there are brilliant experts out there, but not all of them are willing to sit in a committee format for hours and really talk over the specifics of a topic and come to a shared view on how to what to conclude on that topic. And that's really the essence of our work. You need to be a team player. We also focus on making sure we have a balance of the different types of expertise we need. So if we have an expert leaving who had great knowledge of nutritional debates, we'll try to bring in someone else who has that perspective. And then we always try to achieve a balance between different regions of the world. That's really important in our work. And right now we have great representation, I think, from almost every world region. With 25 panel members, you can't represent every country, but we certainly have a good regional balance. And that's absolutely critical because there's so much risk of a kind of global north bias in these debates around food systems. If you look at the most prominent media sources, the most prominent academic institutions, and who really shapes these debates, it's often voices in the global north on a really basic level in terms of how we frame the questions, what we consider are the priorities. So through the composition of our panel, we try to ensure we have that global balance and really can bring through the different perspectives.
What type of work does the panel of experts complete?
So we've kind of diversified our offering over the last few years. I think the main thing we do still is to produce big, comprehensive reports, sometimes referred to as kind of door stoppers, 100-page reports, really comprehensive pieces where we'll take on a big pressing question in food systems. It could be a specific topic area like livestock and protein. It could be looking at specific food system models like agroecology. And we'll take on a big topic and really try to make sense of the vast amount of scientific evidence and literature that's out there, right? And that policymakers have to grapple with. And in a sort of fairly comprehensive format, we'll try to, bring that evidence together, make sense of it, and deliver key recommendations to policymakers on how to move forward. In addition to those kind of big comprehensive reports, we also produce case studies. We've had a set of case studies on urban food policies. We've also produced case studies of agroecological transitions at the kind of community, regional, even national level. And those are an important output in terms of providing positive examples that can inspire others and hopefully be scaled out. More recently, we've been shifting towards kind of shorter formats, producing rapid briefing notes, also open letters, a range of other short formats, allowing us to weigh in a bit more quickly to debates that are unfolding quite rapidly, for example, in response to COVID-19. Within a couple of months of the pandemic starting, we were able to put out a short sort of 10-page briefing note, really establishing, what does this mean for food systems and what responses should we expect. More recently, we've started developing a podcast series for the first time. So in the later part of this year, we'll be co-producing a podcast with a group called Table. And that will be looking at the very complex question of how to get fossil fuels out of food systems. So in that case, we decided, instead of taking on a report on that topic, it might be interesting, first of all, to explore it through a podcast, hear different views from different experts, and go episode by episode through the food chain, looking at how embedded fossil fuels are at those different points in the chain, and where the opportunities are for moving towards less fossil-based systems. And then in addition to that, we try to put out op-eds, press releases as often as possible to react to events. We also produce short animated videos where in a maximum of 2 minutes, we'll try to explain a key issue or key question in food systems in a kind of fun and accessible way. And I think those videos are probably maybe the exception in what we do, where it's something where we're really trying to reach a broader public. Certainly not the general public. These are really aimed at people who maybe have already a pre-existing interest in climate debates and food debates, but might want to know more on a given topic. So those are something we produce quite regularly as well.
What is the IPES lens, and how does it inform the way IPES-Food explores important topics in our food and agriculture system?
Yeah, so I'd say there are kind of 3 components to this. There's the food system approach. That's a really important part of our worldview. And this is really, as I mentioned before, looking holistically at the whole food system, looking all the way upstream to kind of research policies, and then all the way downstream to food retailing, consumption, waste, and thinking about all the connections in that chain at all points. We also take a political economy approach, by which we mean that we pay a lot of attention to the kind of differential power of actors to influence food systems. So, another way to say it would be, it's a really power-centric lens. Essentially, we're interested in who's pulling the strings here in food systems. A third aspect is how we approach knowledge and science. And our reports are based on scientific knowledge and expertise, but we really see value in different types of knowledge, and don't think that the only valuable knowledge is the knowledge that you find in scientific journals. So we'll also pay a lot of attention to reports by NGOs, insights from farmers, community groups who maybe don't have access to those publication opportunities in journals. And we'll make sure that we bring that knowledge and insight into our work as well, really on an equal footing with the formal scientific knowledge. And so if you bring together these different aspects, what does it mean in terms of how we explore a given topic? Ultimately, it means that we will ask why certain questions are being put rather than others, and we'll pay a lot of attention to framing and narratives. So, for example, when we looked at questions around livestock and protein, instead of just trying to answer the question of how do we ensure a protein transition, we asked first and foremost, well, why are we talking about a protein transition? Why protein? Why is that so central in this debate? Whose perspective does that represent? Which power configurations does this reflect? Similarly, we won't just ask, well, how can we feed the world? This question that's being asked. We'll say, well, why is the question being put in those terms? In terms that certainly emphasize global trade, exports as a way to answer the question. So I think, yeah, our perspective is really a very critical one that leads us to unpack the questions at the heart of the debate and try to reformulate those questions in a way that we feel reflects the true priorities and questions to be asked.
How does IPES-Food pave the way for Europe's farm to fork strategy, and what does the strategy entail?
So I mentioned before there was this important milestone moment for us around 2018, 2019, where we took our kind of global analysis and tried to really drill down to the regional level and have an impact in some of those regional and national debates. And I think, yeah, the best example of this type of work was this project we ran from 2016 to 2019 to develop a vision of a common food policy for Europe. So the starting point really here was to say that the debates on food systems in the European Union are limited by the fact that we have the common agricultural policy, and this is really the center point of all discussion. But ultimately, it's just an agricultural policy decided by agricultural interests, most of all, even though the impacts of those policies and the actions it leads to reverberate very widely and affect really all of society through health and climate impacts and so on. So working with around 30 different partner groups, we had a 3-year process with 5 policy labs in Brussels, 4 local labs in cities around Europe that all were already leading the way towards more integrated kind of food policy approaches. And through those labs, we really gradually built a shared vision with a number of partners for a sustainable food policy in Europe, what we called a common food policy. And when we published that vision in 2019, we were able to really show that this had legitimacy behind it, because this had been formed through a very inclusive process over many years involving farmers, NGOs, environmental groups, health groups, anti-poverty groups, etc. And so I think this was a report where, by virtue of that process, we were able to really insist on the relevance, the legitimacy of this work, and it therefore had a big political impact. We spent a lot of time presenting the findings to policymakers, MEPs, people in the European Commission. And the timing coincided with the new European Commission that came in 2019 and was finally willing to take on this question of an integrated food strategy. And I think thanks to our report and some other great work that was done by other groups around that time, the European Commission adopted a farm to fork strategy in 2020 as part of the Green Deal. And although it certainly doesn't go as far as our own vision in terms of paving the way for a sustainable food system in Europe, and it's missing, I think, some of the pieces that you would need to have that really comprehensive policy to guide a huge transition in our food systems. It was still really an important step in the right direction, and the first time that you had that shift away from just sectoral policies towards something more cross-cutting at European level. Since then, there have been a lot of roadblocks to actually implementing this strategy, notably the farmer protests this year that I think have really been instrumentalized by people certainly on the far right, some groups in the European Parliament and beyond, to really try to halt the Green Deal any steps towards a more sustainable food system. So this is all a work in progress. We continue to work on this topic as a member of the EU Food Policy Coalition in Brussels, where we're working with many other NGOs and campaign groups and scientific groups to really keep the pressure on the new European Commission, the new Parliament, to make this vision a reality and to really follow through with an ambitious farm to fork strategy. But the outlook right now is quite uncertain. We're hoping for the best.
One of your experts, Raj Patel, explained in an IPES-Food video that big ag can trap poor countries in debt. How does this happen, and what can be done to combat this issue?
Yeah, so debt is an issue that we've been working on over the last couple of years. In 2022, as I mentioned before, everything really changed with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This had a huge impact on global food systems and led to major food price spikes. But one of the most worrying impacts was the impact on food security in developing countries, particularly in countries that are dependent on food imports. And really, alongside this global food price crisis, we saw the emergence of a global debt crisis, particularly in the global south. And this is closely linked to the food price spikes. And in 2023, we published a report on this topic, and our goal was really to try to draw attention to a debt crisis that is simply being overlooked in global media and is really not getting the attention it deserves. And also to show that this debt crisis is very closely linked to the food systems we have today. And really a key message there is that unsustainable debt and unsustainable food systems are two sides of the same coin. So I mentioned that this crisis really been overlooked. I mean, the current debt levels in the global south are at a historic high. 60% of low-income countries are considered at high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. Over the last couple of years, we've seen some countries default on their debts, including Zambia, Sri Lanka. And there's some more recent data showing that 54 developing countries are spending more than 10% of their annual government budgets on debt interest payments. So that's, really dwarfing anything they're spending on climate resilience or on food security or even education and health. So these countries are really being crippled by those debt levels. And over the last couple of years, there's been very high interest rates. So that's really pushed up the cost of those debt repayments. Now, as I mentioned, there's been very limited awareness of this debt crisis, but even less so, I think, the links to food systems. And in our report, I think we identified 4 different ways that food systems, and especially the industrial food systems and the trade liberalization-based food systems we have today, are contributing to the debt crisis. First of all, it's through the increasing reliance of low-income countries on imports of the foods that they eat every day. So this is something that became a very acute problem in 2022. Countries typically importing quite cheap grain from Ukraine and Russia suddenly couldn't do that. And overnight, the costs of feeding those populations has gone up, doubled in some cases. And this, has a huge strain on public finances and leaves countries in this awful situation of having to decide between, feeding their populations and servicing their debts. And in our report, we explore the way that, this is really a structural part of today's food systems. There are countries that used to be more self-sufficient in basic foods, but over time, they've become increasingly dependent on imports. Instead of producing food to feed their populations, they're producing cash crops for export. The reason they're doing that is that they need to generate dollars. Why? in order to service their debts, which are denominated in dollars, and in order to keep importing staple foods and basic imports. So it's really a cycle that countries are locked into, and it leaves them hugely vulnerable in situations like the food price spikes of 2022. Another way that food systems contribute to the debt crisis is through climate change, right? And food systems in the global south in particular are very, very vulnerable to climate impacts. We're seeing climate change decimate harvests and destroy livelihoods year by year now in so many parts of the world. And again, that's putting a huge consistent strain on public finances in poorer countries, driving up their debt, particularly because we're not seeing any real climate finance materializing despite promises made by wealthy countries. In addition to that, over years, particularly since the structural adjustment period, where we've seen countries really driven towards liberalizing agriculture and reducing their state expenditures, we've seen, depletion of state investment in food systems, and that's really left countries reliant on external financial flows to feed the development of their agricultural sectors. That often means kind of public-private partnerships, like the Agra partnership we've seen in Africa, which are, at least on paper, aimed at increasing productivity and farmer incomes. But as we show in the report, these kind of financial dependencies have impoverished countries over time, and often it's governments who have to pick up the bill, paying interest of unfinished projects, also lots of tax exemptions that are negotiated through these schemes. So governments not able to, tax companies fairly who are extracting value from their food systems. And so this is something, again, contributing to this cycle of debt, and really rooted in the unsustainable, inequitable nature of our food systems. And of course, countries with high debt levels are unable to invest in food systems. They're unable to invest in climate resilience, and they're even more exposed to these cycles. They're more exposed to food price spikes, fertilizer price spikes, and the next climate shocks. So this is a big vicious cycle. And really our message there was that, first of all, we need comprehensive debt relief for these countries, and that's not getting talked about enough. But that has to go hand in hand with really fundamental steps to transform food systems and make them more climate resilient and move away from this industrial model, which is ultimately impoverishing the poorest countries in the world.
In IPES-Food's recent report, Food from Somewhere, territorial markets are explored. What are territorial markets, and how do they differ from corporate value chains that are so common right now?
So maybe I'll start by explaining how we understand corporate value chains, and then I'll describe territorial markets, which are really a contrast to that. So corporate value chains are essentially the dominant food production distribution systems around the world, based around large-scale crop monocultures and factory farming, so industrial agriculture, in other words, systems based around standardized diets, and so the increasing consumption of ultra-processed foods, and also increasing consumption of just a narrow set of crop commodities. I think wheat, maize, and rice alone account for roughly 50 to 60% of global calorie intake now, which is much more than they used to when diets were more diverse. Corporate value chains generally systems based around global trade, long fragmented food supply chains, producing inputs in one country, shipping them to another country where food is grown and harvested. All these steps in the chain requiring quite complex coordination and encountering a number of risks and bottlenecks. If you think about global shipping routes like the Suez Canal and how easily they can be blocked. These are systems that rely on what's known as just-in-time logistics. So as the name suggests, this is about sourcing food at the last minute, having very low inventory, flexible sourcing, looking at the last minute for the cheapest items, which can be advantageous for big food companies, but it means that there's high exposure to shocks and low stock levels at any given point. So this is something that became very problematic in the COVID pandemic, when supply routes were suddenly cut off. And of course, these are systems that, as the name suggests, they're controlled by a handful of dominant corporations who have huge power to set the conditions and prices for the farmers in those chains, and huge power to influence policies and to lobby governments. So in this report, we contrast those systems with what we refer to as territorial markets. So territorial markets, in our understanding, certainly, are food provisioning systems that are based on a very different logic to corporate value chains, really a diametrically opposed logic. So instead of being controlled by a handful of actors, these are food provisioning and marketing systems where power is really distributed. Lots of different actors involved. These are systems based around small-scale producers, processors, and vendors, often farmer-led retailing systems, women-led in many cases. These are multifunctional markets and supply chains. So they're not just getting commodities to people at the lowest cost. They're markets that play multiple roles in their communities and territories. So that could mean markets that also provide a location for farmers to exchange seeds, marketplaces where community organizing also takes place on various levels. The markets we're referring to here are based on short supply chains with less intermediaries, although we're not limiting that to ultra-local production. Quite often there are markets which really show these characteristics, but are on a regional or even national scale. And in terms of like concrete examples here, we're talking about public markets, farmers markets, wet markets, all the different variants that are so diverse globally, street vendors, cooperatives and cooperative-based food marketing systems, urban agriculture and food distribution within cities, on some online direct sales systems, which are really connecting farmers and consumers directly, food hubs, allowing produce to be aggregated and sold across a region, community kitchens, and so many other different marketing systems that are not controlled by corporations. And maybe the crucial thing to say is that these are the food provisioning systems that feed most of the world. So despite the fact that, you know, industrial corporate chains get a lot of the subsidies and they get a lot of the political attention, those chains are not ultimately feeding many people. They're diverting a lot of food calories to animal feed, to fuel. They're converting food into kind of ultra-processed foods, which are ultimately not very nourishing. So the food that actually feeds people, a lot of studies show that that's really coming much more locally. Some studies would suggest up to 70% of people around the world are fed by these territorial markets. And certainly in cities, in the global south, you see how important these markets are, with, you know, people really buying food daily from markets that are much closer to home.
How can territorial markets build food security and resilience moving forward?
So we found, first of all, I think it's important to say that these markets are extremely diverse, and it was really challenging to find comprehensive data on what these markets look like, what they do, what the impacts are. But in spite of that, our research found that these markets are generally making a really important difference in terms of food security, livelihoods, resilience, environmental sustainability as well. And you know, we gathered that information through sort of classic review of scientific reports, but also through regional dialogues in 3 different parts of the world, where we really tried to bring insights from people who are working within these markets and supply chains to understand why they rely on these systems, why they use these systems, and what benefits they consider them to have. And you know, through this review, we were able to really confidently conclude that there are a number of benefits coming from territorial markets. I think first and foremost, making fresh food accessible and affordable to low-income communities. So sometimes we have the perception that supermarkets are the cheapest option, but the data really from a number of global South countries shows that people are able to find more affordable food through public markets and other types of territorial markets. Particularly for low-income populations, these markets are very well adapted to their needs because you can purchase food at flexible quantities through different kind of credit arrangements that aren't possible through the kind of mainstream corporate food system. And there's just a diversity of produce that's sold through these markets that's really critical to healthy, diverse diets. So I'd say that's really the biggest benefit that we uncovered through this report. I think there was also very powerful evidence showing the benefits for food producers in terms of having kind of stable, decent incomes and a decent livelihood through selling on these markets. We looked into examples in Thailand where green farmers markets are an essential part of the landscape there. And people selling in those markets were getting kind of 60 to 80% of their income there, getting better prices than through corporate value chains. And you know, one of the reasons that these markets can deliver livelihood income benefits is that farmers just have more autonomy. Unlike in corporate chains where the planting and harvesting dates might be set by companies, the price is set by those very powerful actors. Here, farmers are able to have more autonomy over the whole process, and that ultimately leads to better livelihoods. Maybe one more big benefit that I would highlight is the resilience to shocks. And we're writing this report, you know, a couple of years after the COVID pandemic, which is pretty much the biggest shock you could imagine to global food supplies when you have whole populations under a lockdown, unable to produce, distribute, buy food in normal ways. And you know, through the pandemic, we saw kind of corporate value chains really struggle as a result of those just-in-time systems I mentioned. There were empty shelves in supermarkets. There was a breakdown, certainly, in a lot of supply chains. In contrast, the evidence on kind of more localized territorial food systems is quite positive, and there's lots of evidence showing how adaptable those systems were. So we looked at case studies where groups of farmers were kind of rapidly adapting to the situation of the pandemic, changing their marketing modalities, going online, moving to different locations, trying to navigate changing rules and difficulties, and just getting food to people at a time when it was very difficult to do so. And I think one really powerful data point in Brazil, where the pandemic, you know, had terrible impacts, about 45% of the emergency food supply initiatives were based on these local supply chains really coming from these territorial markets. And 85% of those were kind of people producing in agroecological, you know, very sustainable systems. So those systems that are sometimes considered niche and irrelevant here, really providing the backbone of the food system in times of crisis and getting food to people.
What are some exciting things that are on the horizon with IPES-Food?
So many. Maybe a very immediate thing. In October, IPES-Food will have a presence at the Global Biodiversity Summit in Cali, Colombia. That's exciting because it's the first time we've really interacted with this forum. We've had our experts in attendance and speaking at the climate COPs over the last few years, where food has become an important issue. But this is the first time that we will have a presence at a global biodiversity forum, and that's because the food systems are such an essential part of that discussion, and we hope that by being there we can really show how a transition to agroecological food systems is a key solution for protecting biodiversity globally. Maybe one more thing I would point to, we are developing a new report on labor, the exploitation of workers in food systems, which we'll be publishing next year. This is such a crucial topic, and it's exciting for us because it's a topic we've wanted to work on for many years. We've finally got the opportunity to do it now. And I think it's an issue where there's so much untapped potential for the public, the broader public, to engage with food systems. I think people would really be shocked and are shocked when they find out the degree of exploitation of workers in food supply chains. It's something that's really hidden away. It's this kind of dark side of the food system that we really don't see when we're buying products off the shelf. We're so distanced from it. We're occasionally made aware of it when there's an expose or a good documentary or briefly comes up on the news. But I think it's a question where people really do care and would like to know more. And hopefully through this report, we'll be able to really show how systematic the exploitation of workers is in food systems, really across the board. And of course, there'll be some solutions in there as well, and some really positive examples of where workers have been organizing to improve the conditions they work under, and where policies have been put in place as well to safeguard working rights in food chains. So we're looking forward to that.
Thank you so much, Nick, for a fantastic interview. It's been really wonderful to hear about all of the exciting pieces of work that IPES-Food is working on. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Rosemary.